The Fifth Child, by Doris Lessing. Harriet and David met each other at an office party neither had particularly wanted to go to, and both knew at once that this was what they had been waiting for. Someone conservative, old-fashioned, not to say obsolescent, timid, hard to please. This is what other people called them, but there was no end to the unaffectionate adjectives they earned. They defended a stubbornly held view of themselves, which was that they were ordinary and in the right of it, should not be criticized for emotional fastidiousness, abstemiousness, just because these were unfashionable qualities. At this famous office party, about 200 people crammed into a long, ornate, and solemn room, for 334 days of the year a boardroom. 3 associated firms, all to do with putting up buildings, were having their end-of-year party. It was noisy. The pounding rhythm of a small band shook walls and floor. Most people were dancing, packed close because of lack of space, couples bobbing up and down or revolving in one spot as if they were on invisible turntables. The women were dressed up, dramatic, bizarre, full of color. Look at me. Look at me. Some of the men demanded as much attention. Around the walls were pressed a few non-dancers, and among these were Harriet and David, standing by themselves, holding glasses, observers. Both had reflected that the faces of the dancers, women more than men, but men, too, could just as well have been distorted in screams and grimaces of pain as in enjoyment. There was a forced hecticity to the scene, but these thoughts, like so many others, they had not expected to share with anyone else. From across the room, if one saw her at all among so many eye-demanding people, Harriet was a pastel blur. As in an impressionist picture or a trick photograph, she seemed a girl merged with her surroundings. She stood near a great vase of dried grasses and leaves, and her dress was something flowery. The focusing eye then saw curly dark hair, which was unfashionable, blue eyes soft but thoughtful, lips rather too firmly closed. In fact, all her features were strong and good, and she was solidly built. A healthy young woman, but perhaps more at home in a garden? David had been standing just where he was for an hour drinking judiciously, his serious gray-blue eyes taking their time over this person, that couple, watching how people engaged and separated, ricocheting off each other. To Harriet, he did not have the look of someone solidly planted. He seemed almost to hover, balancing on the balls of his feet. A slight young man, he looked younger than he was. He had a round, candid face and soft brown hair girls longed to run their fingers through. But then that contemplative gaze of his made itself felt, and they desisted. He made them feel uncomfortable. Not Harriet. She knew his look of watchful apartness mirrored her own. She judged his humorous air to be an effort. He was making similar mental comments about her. She seemed to dislike these occasions as much as he did. Both had found out who the other was. Harriet was in the sales department of a firm that designed and supplied building materials. David was an architect. So what was it about these two that made them freaks and oddballs? It was their attitude to sex. This was the 60s. David had had one long and difficult affair with a girl he was reluctantly in love with. She was what he did not want in a girl. They joked about the attraction between opposites. She joked that he thought of reforming her. I do believe you imagine you are going to put the clock back, starting with me. Since they had parted, unhappily enough, she had slept, so David reckoned, with everyone in Sisson's Blend and Company. With the girls, too, he wouldn't be surprised. She was here tonight, in a scarlet dress with black lace, a witty travesty of a flamenco dress. From this concoction her head startlingly emerged. It was pure 1920s, for her black hair was sleeked down into a spike on her neck at the back, with 2 glossy black spikes over her ears, and a black lock on her forehead. She sent frantic waves and kisses to David from across the room where she circled with her partner, and he smiled mattily back. No hard feelings. As for Harriet, she was a virgin. A virgin now, her girlfriends might shriek, "Are you crazy?" She had not thought of herself as a virgin, if this meant a physiological condition to be defended, but rather as something like a present wrapped up in layers of deliciously pretty paper, to be given, with discretion, to the right person. Her own sisters laughed at her. The girls working in the office looked studiedly humorous when she insisted, "I am sorry, I don't like all this sleeping around, it's not for me." She knew she was discussed as an always interesting subject and usually unkindly, with the same chilly contempt that good women of her grandmother's generation might have used, saying, "She is quite immoral, you know," or "She's no better than she ought to be," or "She hasn't got a moral to her name," then, her mother's generation, "She's man-mad." Or, "She's a nympho," so did the enlightened girls of now say to each other. It must be something in her childhood that's made her like this. Poor thing. And indeed, she had sometimes felt herself unfortunate or deficient in some way, because the men with whom she went out for a meal or to the cinema would take her refusal as much as evidence of a pathological outlook as an ungenerous one. She had gone about with a girl friend, younger than the others, for a time, but then this one had become like all the others, as Harriet despairingly defined her, defining herself as a misfit. She spent many evenings alone and went home often at weekends to her mother, who said, "Well, you're old-fashioned, that's all." And a lot of girls would like to be if they got the chance. These two eccentrics, Harriet and David, set off from their respective corners towards each other at the same moment. This was to be important to them as the famous office party became part of their story. Yes, at exactly the same time. They had to push past people already squeezed against walls. They held their glasses high above their heads to keep them out of the way of the dancers. And so they arrived together at last, smiling, but perhaps a trifle anxiously, and he took her hand and they squeezed their way out of this room into the next, which had the buffet and was as full of noisy people, and through that into a corridor, sparsely populated with embracing couples, and then pushed open the first door whose handle yielded to them. It was an office that had a desk and hard chairs and, as well, a sofa. Silence. Well, almost. They sighed. They set down their glasses. They sat facing each other, so they might look as much as they wished, and then began to talk. They talked as if talk were what had been denied to them both, as if they were starving for talk. And they went on sitting there, close, talking, until the noise began to lessen in the rooms across the corridor, and then they went quietly out and to his flat, which was near. There they lay on his bed holding hands and talked, and sometimes kissed, and then slept. Almost at once she moved into his flat, for she had been able to afford only a room in a big communal flat. They had already decided to marry in the spring. Why wait? They were made for each other. Harriet was the oldest of 3 daughters. It was not until she left home, at 18, that she knew how much she owed to her childhood, for many of her friends had divorced parents, led adventitious and haphazard lives, and tended to be, as it is put, disturbed. Harriet was not disturbed, and had always known what she wanted. She had done well enough at school, and went to an arts college where she became a graphic designer, which seemed an agreeable way of spending her time until she married. The question whether to be, or not to be, a career woman had never bothered her, though she was prepared to discuss it. She did not like to appear more eccentric than she had to be. Her mother was a contented woman who had everything she could reasonably want, so it appeared to her and to her daughters. Harriet's parents had taken it for granted that family life was the basis for a happy one. David's background was a quite different matter. His parents had divorced when he was 7. He joked, far too often, that he had 2 sets of parents. He had been one of the children with a room in 2 homes, and everybody considerate about psychological problems. There had been no nastiness or spite, if plenty of discomfort, even unhappiness, that is, for the children. His mother's second husband, David's other father, was an academic, an historian, and there was a large shabby house in Oxford. David liked this man, Frederick Burke, who was kind, if remote, like his mother, who was kind and remote. His room in this house had been his home, was, in his imagination, his real home now, though soon, with Harriet, he would create another, an extension and amplification of it. This home of his was a large bedroom at the back of the house overlooking a neglected garden, a shabby room, full of his boyhood, and rather chilly, in the English manner. His real father married one of his kind. She was a noisy, kind, competent woman, with the cynical good humor of the rich. James Lovett was a boat builder, and when David did consent to visit, his place could easily be a bunk on a yacht, or a room. "This is your room, David," in a villa in the south of France or the West Indies. But he preferred his old room in Oxford. He had grown up with a fierce private demand on his future. For his own children, it would all be different. He knew what he wanted and the kind of woman he needed. If Harriet had seen her future in the old way, that a man would hand her the keys of her kingdom, and there she would find everything her nature demanded, and this as her birthright, which she had, at first unknowingly, but then very determinedly, been traveling towards, refusing all muddles and dramas, then he saw his future as something he must aim for and protect. His wife must be like him in this, that she knew where happiness lay and how to keep it. He was 30 when he met Harriet, and he had been working in the dogged, disciplined manner of an ambitious man, but what he was working for was a home. Not possible to find the kind of house they wanted, for the life they wanted, in London. Anyway, they were not sure London was what they needed. No, it wasn't. They would prefer a smallish town with an atmosphere of its own. Weekends were spent looking around towns within commuting distance of London, and they soon found a large Victorian house in an overgrown garden. Perfect. But for a young couple it was absurd, a 3-storied house, with an attic full of rooms, corridors, landings. Full of space for children, in fact. But they meant to have a lot of children. Both, somewhat defiantly, because of the enormity of their demands on the future, announced they would not mind a lot of children. Even 4 or 5. Or 6, said David. Or 6, said Harriet, laughing to the point of tears from relief. They had laughed and rolled about the bed and kissed and were exuberant because this, the place where both had expected and even been prepared to accept rebuff or a compromise, had turned out to be no danger at all. But while Harriet could say to David, David to Harriet, 6 children at least, they could not say this to anyone else. Even with David's quite decent salary and Harriet's, the mortgage of this house would be beyond them. But they would manage somehow. She would work for 2 years, commute with David daily to London, and then, on the afternoon the house became theirs, they stood hand in hand in the little porch, birds singing all around them in the garden where boughs were still black and glistening with the chilly rain of early spring. They unlocked their front door, their hearts thudding with happiness, and stood in a very large room, facing capacious stairs. Some previous owner had seen a home as they did. Walls had been pulled down to make this a room that accommodated nearly all the ground floor. One half of it was a kitchen, marked off from the rest by no more than a low wall that would have books on it, the other half with plenty of space for settees, chairs, all the sprawl and comfort of a family room. They went gently, softly, hardly breathing, smiling and looking at each other and smiling even more because both had tears in their eyes. They went across the bare boards that soon would have rugs on them, and then slowly up the stairs where old-fashioned brass rods waited for a carpet. On the landing, they turned to marvel at the great room that would be the heart of their kingdom. They went on up. The first floor had one large bedroom, theirs, and opening off it a smallish room, which would be for each new baby. There were 4 other decent rooms on this floor. Up still generous, but narrower stairs, and there were 4 more rooms whose windows, like the rooms below, showed trees, gardens, lawns, all the perspectives of pleasant suburbia. And above this floor was an enormous attic, just right for the children when they had got to the age for secret magical games. They slowly descended the stairs, 1 flight, 2, passing rooms and rooms, which they were imagining full of children, relatives, guests, and came again into their bedroom. A large bed had been left in it. It had been specially made, that bed, for the couple they had bought the house from. To take it away, so said the agent, would have meant dismantling it, and anyway the owners of the bed were going to live abroad. There Harriet and David lay down side by side and looked at their room. They were quiet, awed by what they were taking on. Shadows from a lilac tree, a wet sun behind it, seemed to be enticingly sketching on the expanses of the ceiling the years they would live in this house. They turned their heads towards the windows where the top of the old lilac showed its vigorous buds, soon to burst into flower. Then they looked at each other. Tears ran down their cheeks. They made love, there on their bed. Harriet almost cried out, "No, stop. What are we doing?" For had they not decided to put off having children for 2 years? But she was overwhelmed by his purpose. Yes, That was it. He was making love with a deliberate, concentrated intensity, looking into her eyes, that made her accept him, his taking possession of the future in her. She did not have contraceptives with her. Both, of course, distrusted the pill. She was at the height of her fertility. But they made love, with this solemn deliberation. Once. Twice. Later, when the room was dark, they made love again. "Well," said Harriet, in a little voice, for she was frightened and determined not to show it, "well, that's done it, I'm sure." He laughed. A loud, reckless, and scrupulous laugh, quite unlike modest, humorous, judicious David. Now the room was quite dark. It looked vast, like a black cave that had no end. A branch scraped across a wall somewhere close. There was a smell of cold, rainy earth and sex. David lay smiling to himself, and when he felt her look, he turned his head slightly and his smile included her. But on his terms, his eyes gleamed with thoughts she could not guess at. She felt she did not know him. "David," she said quickly, to break the spell, but his arm tightened around her, and he gripped her upper arm with a hand she had not believed could be so strong, insistent. This grip said, "Be quiet." They lay there together while ordinariness slowly came back, and then they were able to turn to each other and kiss with small, reassuring daytime kisses. They got up and dressed in the cold dark. The electricity wasn't on yet. Quietly, they went down the stairs of their house where they had so thoroughly taken possession, and into their great family room, and let themselves out into the garden that was mysterious and hidden from them, not yet theirs. "Well," said Harriet humorously as they got into his car to return to London. "And how are we going to pay for it all if I am pregnant?" Quite so. How were they? Harriet indeed became pregnant on that rainy evening in their bedroom. They had many bad moments, thinking of the slenderness of their resources and of their own frailty. For at such times, when material support is not enough, it is as if we are being judged. Harriet and David seemed to themselves meager and inadequate, with nothing to hold on to but stubborn beliefs other people had always judged as wrong-headed. David had never taken money from his well-off father and stepmother, who had paid for his education, but that was all. And for his sister Deborah's education, but she had preferred her father's way of life as he had preferred his mother's, and so they had not often met, and the differences between brother and sister seemed to him summed up in this, that she had chosen the life of the rich. He did not now want to ask for money. His English parents, which was how he thought of his mother and her husband, had little money, being unambitious academics. One afternoon, these four, David and Harriet, David's mother, Molly, with Frederick, stood in the family room by the stairs and surveyed the new kingdom. There was by now a very large table, which would easily accommodate 15 or 20 people, at the kitchen end. There were a couple of vast sofas and some commodious armchairs bought secondhand at a local auction. David and Harriet stood together, feeling themselves even more preposterously eccentric and much too young, faced with these two elderly people who judged them. Molly and Frederick were large and untidy, with a great deal of gray hair, wearing comfortable clothes that complacently despised fashion. They looked like benevolent haystacks, but were not looking at each other in a way David knew well. "All right, then," he said humorously, unable to bear the strain, "you can say it." And he put his arm around Harriet, who was pale and strained because of morning sickness and because she had spent a week scrubbing floors and washing windows. "Are you going to run a hotel?" inquired Frederick reasonably, determined not to make a judgment. "How many children are you intending to have?" asked Molly, with the short laugh that means there is no point in protesting. "A lot," said David softly. "Yes," said Harriet. "Yes." She did not realize, as David did, how annoyed these two parents were. Aiming, like all their kind, at an appearance of unconformity, they were in fact the essence of convention and disliked any manifestation of the spirit of exaggeration, of excess. This house was that. "Come on, we'll give you dinner, if there is a decent hotel," said David's mother. Over that meal, other subjects were discussed until, over coffee, Molly observed, "You do realize that you are going to have to ask your father for help?" David seemed to wince and suffer, but he had to face it. What mattered was the house and the life that would be lived in it. A life that, Both parents knew because of his look of determined intention, which they judged full of the smugness of youth, was going to annul, absolve, cancel out all the deficiencies of their life, Molly's and Frederick's, and of James's and Jessica's life, too. As they separated in the dark car park of the hotel, Frederick said, "As far as I am concerned, you are both rather mad." "Well, wrong-headed, then." "Yes," said Molly. "You haven't really thought it out. Children, no one who hasn't had them knows what work they make." Here David laughed, making a point and an old one, which Molly recognized and faced with a conscious laugh. "You are not maternal," said David. "It's not your nature. But Harriet is." "Very well," said Molly, "it's your life." She telephoned James, her first husband, who was on a yacht near the Isle of Wight. This conversation ended with, "I think you should come and see for yourself." "Very well, I will," said he, agreeing as much to what had not been said as to what had. His difficulty in keeping up with his wife's unspoken languages was the main reason he had been pleased to leave her. Soon after this conversation, David and Harriet again stood with David's parents, the other pair, in contemplation of the house. This time they were outside it. Jessica stood in the middle of a lawn, still covered with the woody debris of the winter and a windy spring, and critically surveyed the house. To her it was gloomy and detestable, like England. She was the same age as Molly and looked 20 years younger, being lean and brown and seeming to glisten with sun oil even when her skin was without it. Her hair was yellow and short and shiny and her clothes bright. She dug the heels of her jade-green shoes in the lawn and looked at her husband, James. He had already been over the house and now he said, as David had expected, "It's a good investment." "Yes," said David. "It's not overpriced." "I suppose that's because it's too big for most people." "I take it the surveyor's report was all right." "Yes," said David. "In that case, I shall assume responsibility for the mortgage." "How long is it going to take to pay off?" 30 years, said David. "I'll be dead by then, I expect." "Well, I didn't give you much in the way of a wedding present." "You'll have to do the same by Deborah," said Jessica. "We have already done much more for Deborah than for David," said James. "Anyway, we can afford it." She laughed and shrugged. It was mostly her money. This ease with money characterized their life together, which David had sampled and rejected fiercely, preferring the parsimony of the Oxford house, though he had never used that word aloud. Flashy and too easy, that was the life of the rich, but now he was going to be beholden to it. "And how many kids are you planning, if one may ask?" inquired Jessica, looking like a parakeet perched on that damp lawn. "A lot," said David. "A lot," said Harriet. "Rather you than me, then," said Jessica, and with that David's other parents left the garden, and then England, with relief. Now entered onto the scene Dorothy, Harriet's mother. It occurred to neither Harriet nor David to think, or say, "Oh God, how awful, having one's mother around all the time," for if family life was what they had chosen, then it followed that Dorothy should come indefinitely to help Harriet, while insisting that she had a life of her own to which she must return. She was a widow, and this life of hers was mostly visiting her daughters. The family house was sold, and she had a small flat, not very nice, but she was not one to complain. When she had taken in the size and potential of the new house, she was more silent than usual for some days. She had not found it easy bringing up 3 girls. Her husband had been an industrial chemist, not badly paid, but there never had been much money. She knew the cost, in every way, of a family, even a small one. She attempted some remarks on these lines one evening at supper. David, Harriet, Dorothy. David had just come home late. The train was delayed. Commuting was not going to be much fun, was going to be the worst of it, for everyone, but particularly, of course, David, for it would take nearly 2 hours twice a day to get to and from work. This would be one of his contributions to the dream. The kitchen was already near what it ought to be, the great table, with heavy wooden chairs around it, only 4 now, but more stood in a row along the wall, waiting for guests and still unborn people. There was a big stove, an aga, and an old-fashioned dresser with cups and mugs on hooks. Jugs were full of flowers from the garden where summer had revealed a plenitude of roses and lilies. They were eating a traditional English pudding, made by Dorothy, Outside, the autumn was establishing itself in flying leaves that sometimes hit the window panes with small thuds and bangs, and in the sound of a rising wind. But the curtains were drawn, warm, thick, flowered curtains. "You know," said Dorothy, "I've been thinking about you too." David put down his spoon to listen, as he would never have done for his unworldly mother or his worldly father. "I don't believe you two ought to rush into everything. No, let me have my say. Harriet is only 24, not 25 yet. You are only just 30, David. You two go on as if you believe if you don't grab everything, then you'll lose it." "Well, that's the impression I get, listening to you talk." David and Harriet were listening. Their eyes did meet, frowning, thoughtful. Dorothy, this large, wholesome, homely woman, with her decisive manner, her considered ways, was not to be ignored. They recognized what was due to her. "I do feel that," said Harriet. "Yes, girl, I know. You were talking yesterday of having another baby straight away. You'll regret it, in my view." "Everything could very well be taken away," said David, stubborn. The enormity of this, something that came from his depths, as both women knew, was not lessened by the news, which was blasting from the radio. Bad news from everywhere. Nothing to what the news would soon become, but threatening enough. "Think about it," said Dorothy. "I wish you would. Sometimes you two scare me. I don't really know why." Harriet said fiercely, "Perhaps we ought to have been born into another country. Do you realize that having 6 children in another part of the world, it would be normal, nothing shocking about it. They aren't made to feel criminals." "It's we who are abnormal, here in Europe," said David. "I don't know about that," said Dorothy, as stubborn as either of them. "But if you were having 6 or 8 or 10, no, I know what you are thinking, Harriet, I know you, don't I? And if you were in another part of the world, like Egypt or India or somewhere, then half of them would die and they wouldn't be educated, either. You want things both ways. The aristocracy, yes, they can have children like rabbits and expect to, but they have the money for it. And poor people can have children and half of them die and expect to. But people like us, in the middle, we have to be careful about the children we have so we can look after them. It seems to me you haven't thought it out. No, I'll go and make the coffee. You two go and sit down." David and Harriet went through the wide gap in the wall that marked off the kitchen to the sofa in the living room, where they sat holding hands, a slight, stubborn, rather perturbed young man and an enormous, flushed, clumsily moving woman. Harriet was 8 months pregnant, and it had not been an easy pregnancy. Nothing seriously wrong, but she had been sick a lot, slept badly from indigestion, and was disappointed with herself. They were wondering why it was that people always criticized them. Dorothy brought coffee, set it down, said, "I'll do the washing up. No, you just sit there," and went back to the sink. "But it is what I feel," said Harriet, distressed. "Yes, we should have children while we can," said Harriet. Dorothy said, "From the sink, at the beginning of the last war, people were saying it was irresponsible to have children, but we had them, didn't we?" She laughed. "There you are, then," said David. "And we kept them," said Dorothy. "Well, here I am certainly," said Harriet. The first baby, Luke, was born in the big bed attended mostly by the midwife, with Dr. Brett there, too. David and Dorothy held Harriet's hands. It goes without saying that the doctor had wanted Harriet in hospital. She had been adamant, was disapproved of by him. It was a windy cold night, just after Christmas. The room was warm and wonderful. David wept. Dorothy wept. Harriet laughed and wept. The midwife and the doctor had a little air of festivity and triumph. They all drank champagne and poured some on little Luke's head. It was 1966. Luke was an easy baby. He slept most peaceably in the little room off the big bedroom and was contentedly breastfed. Happiness. When David went off to catch his train to London in the mornings, Harriet was sitting up in bed feeding the baby and drinking the tea David had brought her. When he bent to kiss her goodbye and stroked Luke's head, it was with a fierce possessiveness that Harriet liked and understood, for it was not herself being possessed or the baby, but happiness. Hers and his. That Easter was the first of the family parties. Rooms had been adequately, if sketchily, furnished, and they were filled with Harriet's 2 sisters, Sarah and Angela, and their husbands and their children, with Dorothy, in her element, and briefly by Molly and Frederick, who allowed that they were enjoying themselves, but family life on this scale was not for them. Connoisseurs of the English scene will by now have realized that on that powerful, if nowhere registered, yardstick, the English class system, Harriet scaled rather lower than David. Within 5 seconds of any of the Lovitts or the Burkes meeting any of the Walkers, the fact had been noted but not commented on verbally at least. The Walkers were not surprised that Frederick and Molly said they would be there for only 2 days, nor that they changed their minds when James Lovitt appeared. Like many husbands and wives forced to separate by incompatibility, Molly and James enjoyed meeting when they knew they must shortly part. In fact, they all enjoyed themselves, agreeing that the house was made for it. Around the great family table, where so many chairs could be comfortably accommodated, people sat through long pleasant meals, or found their way there between meals to drink coffee and tea and to talk. And laugh. Listening to the laughter, the voices, the talk, the sounds of children playing, Harriet and David in their bedroom, or perhaps descending from the landing, would reach for each other's hand, and smile, and breathe happiness. No one knew, not even Dorothy, certainly not Dorothy, that Harriet was pregnant again. Luke was 3 months old. They had not meant for Harriet to be pregnant, not for another year. But so it was. "There's something progenitive about this room, I swear it," said David, laughing. They felt agreeably guilty. They lay in their bed, listening to Luke make his baby noises next door, and decided not to say a word until after everyone had gone. When Dorothy was told, she was again rather silent, and then said, "Well, you'll need me, won't you?" They did. This pregnancy, like the other, was normal, but Harriet was uncomfortable and sick, and thought to herself that while she had not changed her mind at all about 6, or 8, or 10 children, she would be jolly sure there was a good interval between this one and the next. For the rest of the year, Dorothy was pleasantly around the house, helped look after Luke and to make curtains for the rooms on the 3rd floor. That Christmas, Harriet was again enormous, in her 8th month, and she laughed at herself for her size and unwieldiness. The house was full. All the people who were here for Easter came again. It was acknowledged that Harriet and David had a gift for this kind of thing. A cousin of Harriet's with 3 children came, too, for she had heard of the wonderful Easter party that had gone on for a week. A colleague of David's came with his wife. This Christmas was 10 days long, and one feast followed another. Luke was in his pram downstairs, and everyone fussed over him, and the older children carried him around like a doll. Briefly, too, came David's sister Deborah, a cool, attractive girl who could easily have been Jessica's daughter and not Molly's. She was not married, though she had had what she described as near misses. In general style, she was so far removed from the people in the house, all basic British as they defined themselves relative to her, that these differences became a running joke. She had always lived the life of the rich, had found the shabby high-mindedness of her mother's house irritating, hated people being crammed together, but conceded that she found this party interesting. There were 12 adults and 10 children. Neighbors, invited, did appear, but the sense of family togetherness was strong and excluded them. And Harriet and David exulted that their obstinacy, what everyone had criticized and laughed at, had succeeded in this miracle. They were able to unite all these so different people and make them enjoy each other. The second child, Helen, was born, like Luke, in the family bed, with all the same people there, and again champagne anointed the baby's head, and everyone wept. Luke was evicted from the baby's room into the next one down the corridor, and Helen took his place. Though Harriet was tired, indeed, worn out, the Easter party took place. Dorothy was against it. "You are tired, girl," she said. "You are bone-tired." Then, seeing Harriet's face, "Well, all right, but you aren't to do anything, mind." The 2 sisters and Dorothy made themselves responsible for the shopping and the cooking, the hard work. Downstairs among all the people, for the house was again full, were the 2 little creatures, Helen and Luke, all wispy fair hair and blue eyes and pink cheeks. Luke was staggering about, aided by everyone, and Helen was in her pram. That summer, the house was full to the attic, nearly all family. The house was so convenient for London. People traveled up with David for the day and came back with him. There was good walking country 20 minutes drive away. People came and went, said they were coming for a couple of days and stayed a week. And how was all this paid for? Well, of course everyone contributed, and of course, not enough, but people knew David's father was rich. Without that mortgage being paid for, none of this could have happened. Money was always tight. Economies were made. A vast hotel-sized freezer bought secondhand was stocked with summer fruit and vegetables. Dorothy and Sarah and Angela bottled fruit and jam and chutneys. They baked bread and the whole house smelled of new bread. This was happiness in the old style. There was a cloud, though. Sarah and her husband, William, were unhappily married and quarreled and made up, but she was pregnant with her fourth, and a divorce was not possible. Christmas, just as wonderful a festival, came and went. Then Easter. Sometimes they all had to wonder where everybody was fitting themselves in. The cloud on family happiness that was Sarah and William's discord disappeared, for it was absorbed in worse. Sarah's new baby was Down syndrome, and there was no question of them separating. Dorothy remarked sometimes that it was a pity there wasn't two of her. Sarah needed her as much, and more, than Harriet. And indeed, she did take off on visits to her Sarah, who was afflicted, while Harriet was not. Jane was born in 1970, when Helen was 2. Much too fast, scolded Dorothy. What was the hurry? Helen moved into Luke's room, and Luke moved one room along. Jane made her contented noises in the baby's room, and the two little children came into the big family bed and cuddled and played games, or they visited Dorothy in her bed and played there. Happiness. A happy family. The Lovitts were a happy family. It was what they had chosen and what they deserved. Often, when David and Harriet lay face to face, it seemed that doors in their breasts flew open, and what poured out was an intensity of relief, of thankfulness, that still astonished them both. Patience for what seemed now such a very long time had not been easy. After all, it had been hard preserving their belief in themselves when the spirit of the times, the greedy and selfish 60s, had been so ready to condemn them, to isolate, to diminish their best selves. And look, they had been right to insist on guarding that stubborn individuality of theirs, which had chosen, and so obstinately, the best, this. Outside this fortunate place, their family beat and battered the storms of the world. The easy good times had utterly gone. David's firm had been struck, and he had not been given the promotion he expected, but others had lost their jobs and he was lucky. Sarah's husband was out of work. Sarah joked dolefully that she and William attracted all the ill luck in the clan. Harriet said to David, privately, that she did not believe it was bad luck. Sarah and William's unhappiness, their quarreling, had probably attracted the Mongol child. Yes, of course she knew one shouldn't call them Mongol. But the little girl did look a bit like Genghis Khan, didn't she? A baby Genghis Khan with her squashed little face and her slitty eyes? David disliked this trait of Harriet's, a fatalism that seemed so at odds with the rest of her. He said he thought this was silly, hysterical thinking. Harriet sulked, and they had to make up. The little town they lived in had changed in the 5 years they had been here. Brutal incidents and crimes, once shocking everyone, were now commonplace. Gangs of youths hung around certain cafes and street ends and owed respect to no one. The house next door had been burgled 3 times. The Lovitts not yet, but then there were always people about. At the end of the road there was a telephone box that had been vandalized so often the authorities had given up, it stood unusable. These days, Harriet would not dream of walking at night by herself, but once it would not have occurred to her not to go anywhere she pleased at any time of the day or night. There was an ugly edge on events. More and more it seemed that 2 peoples lived in England, not one enemies, hating each other, who could not hear what the other said. The young Lovitts made themselves read the papers and watch the news on television, though their instinct was to do neither. At least they ought to know what went on outside their fortress, their kingdom, in which 3 precious children were nurtured, and where so many people came to immerse themselves in safety, comfort, kindness. The 4th baby, Paul, was born in 1973, between a Christmas and an Easter. Harriet was not very well. Her pregnancies had continued uncomfortable and full of minor problems, nothing serious, but she was tired. The Easter festivities were the best ever. That year was the best of all their years, and, looking back afterwards, it seemed that the whole year was a celebration, renewed from a spring of loving hospitality whose guardians were Harriet and David. Beginning at Christmas, when Harriet was so very pregnant, everyone looking after her, sharing in the work of creating magnificent meals, involved with the coming baby, knowing that Easter was coming, then the long summer, then Christmas again. Easter went on for 3 weeks, all of the school holidays. The house was crammed. The 3 little children had their own rooms, but moved in together when beds were needed. Which of course they adored. Why not let them sleep together always? Dorothy, the others would inquire. A room each for such little tiddlers. It's important, said David, fierce. Everyone should have a room. The family exchanged glances as families do when stubbing toes on some snag in one of them, and Molly, who felt herself both appreciated, but in some devious way criticized, too, said, everyone in the world. Everybody. She had intended to sound humorous. This scene was at breakfast, or rather, mid-morning, in the family room, breakfast continuing indefinitely. All the adults were still around the table, 15 of them. The children played among the sofas and chairs of the sitting room area. Molly and Frederick sat side by side, as always, preserving their air of judging everything by the perspectives of Oxford, for which, here, they often got teased, but did not seem to mind, and were humorously on the defensive. David's father, James, had been written to again by Molly, who had said he must fork out more money. The young couple simply were not coping with feeding Uncle Tom Cobley and all. He had sent a generous check, and then had come himself. He sat opposite his former wife and her husband, and as usual both kinds of people were observed examining each other and marveling that they could ever have come together. He looked fitted out for some sporting occasion. In fact, he was off skiing shortly, like Deborah, who was here with her little air of an exotic bird that had alighted in a strange place and was kept there by curiosity. She was not going to admit to admiration. Dorothy was there, dispensing tea and coffee. Angela sat with her husband. Her 3 children played with the others. Angela, efficient, brisk, a coper, as Dorothy said, the thank God being unspoken, allowed it to be known that she felt the 2 other sisters took up all of Dorothy and left her nothing. She was like a clever, pretty little fox. Sarah's husband, cousins, friends, the big house had people tucked into every corner, even on the sofas down here. The attic had long ago become a dormitory stacked with mattresses and sleeping bags in which any number of children could be bedded. As they sat here in the great warm, comfortable room, which had a fire burning of wood collected by everyone yesterday from the woodland they had been walking in, the rooms above resounded with voices and with music. Some of the older children were practicing a song. This was a house, and this defined it for everyone, admiring what they could not achieve themselves, where television was not often watched. Sarah's husband, William, was not at the table, but lounging against the dividing wall, and the little distance expressed what he felt his relation to the family was. He had left Sarah twice and come home again. It was evident to everyone this was a process that would continue. He had got himself a job, a poor one, in the building trade. The trouble was that he was distressed by physical disability, and his new daughter, the Down syndrome baby, appalled him. Yet he was very much married to Sarah. They were a match, both tall, generously built, dark, like a pair of gypsies, always in colorful clothes. But the poor baby was in Sarah's arms, covered up so as not to upset everyone, and William was looking everywhere but at his wife. He looked instead at Harriet, who sat nursing Paul, 2 months old, in the big chair that was hers because it was comfortable for this function. She looked exhausted. Jane had been awake in the night with her teeth, and had wanted Mummy, not Granny. She had not been much changed by presenting the world with 4 human beings. She sat there at the head of the table, the collar of her blue shirt pushed to one side to show part of a blue-veined white breast, and Paul's energetically moving little head. Her lips were characteristically firmly set, and she was observing everything, a healthy, attractive young woman, full of life. But tired, the children came rushing from their play to demand her attention, and she was suddenly irritable and snapped, "Why don't you go and play upstairs in the attic?" This was unlike her. Again, glances were exchanged among the adults, who took over the job of getting the children's noise out of her way. In the end, it was Angela who went with them. Harriet was distressed because she had been bad-tempered. "I was up all night," she began, and William interrupted her, taking command, expressing what they all felt, and Harriet knew it, even if she knew why it had to be William, the delinquent husband and father. "And now that's got to be it, sister-in-law Harriet," he announced, leaning forward from his wall, hand raised, like a band leader. "How old are you?" "No, don't tell me I know, and you've had 4 children in 6 years." Here he looked around to make sure they were all with him. They were, and Harriet could see it. She smiled ironically. "A criminal," she said, "that's what I am." "Give it a rest, Harriet. That's all we ask of you," he went on, sounding more and more facetious, histrionic, as was his way. "The father of 4 children speaks," said Sarah, passionately cuddling her poor Amy, defying them to say aloud what they must be thinking, that she was going out of her way to support him, her unsatisfactory husband, in front of them all. He gave her a grateful look while his eyes avoided the pathetic bundle she protected. "Yes, but at least we spread it out over 10 years, he said. "We are going to give it a rest," announced Harriet. She added, sounding defiant, "for at least 3 years. Everyone exchanged looks. She thought them condemning. "I told you so," said William. "These madmen are going to go on." "These madmen certainly are," said David. "I told you so," said Dorothy. "When Harriet's got an idea into her head, then you can save your breath." "Just like her mother," said Sarah forlornly. This referred to Dorothy's decision that Harriet needed her more than Sarah did, the defective child notwithstanding. "You're much tougher than she is, Sarah," Dorothy had pronounced. "The trouble with Harriet is that her eyes have always been bigger than her stomach." Dorothy was near Harriet, with little Jane, listless from the bad night, dozing in her arms. She sat erect, solid. Her lips were set firm. Her eyes missed nothing. "Why not?" said Harriet. She smiled at her mother. "How could I do better?" "They're going to have 4 more children," Dorothy said, appealing to the others. "Good God," said James, admiring but awed. "Well, it's just as well I make so much money." David did not like this. He flushed and would not look at anyone. "Oh, don't be like that, David," said Sarah, trying not to sound bitter. She needed money, badly, but it was David, who was in a good job, who got so much extra. "You aren't really going to have 4 more children?" inquired Sarah, sighing, and they all knew she was saying, "for more challenges to destiny." She gently put her hand over the sleeping Amy's head, covered in a shawl, holding it safe from the world. "Yes, we are," said David. "Yes, we certainly are," said Harriet. "This is what everyone wants, really, but we've been brainwashed out of it. People want to live like this, really." "Happy families," said Molly critically. She was standing up for a life where domesticity was kept in its place, a background to what was important. "We're the center of this family," said David. "We are Harriet and me. Not you, Mother." "God forbid," said Molly, her large face, always highly colored, even more flushed. She was annoyed. "Oh, all right," said her son. "It's never been your style." "It's certainly never been mine," said James, "and I'm not going to apologize for it." "But you've been a marvelous father, chirruped Deborah. "And Jessica's been a supermom." Her real mother raised her ponderous brows. "I don't seem to remember your ever giving Molly much of a chance," said Frederick. "But it's so cold in England," moaned Deborah. James, in his bright, overbright clothes, a handsome, well-preserved gent dressed for a southern summer, allowed himself the ironical snort of the oldster at youthful tactlessness, and his look at his wife and her husband apologized for Deborah. "And anyway," he insisted, "it isn't my style." "You're quite wrong, Harriet. The opposite is true. People are brainwashed into believing family life is the best. But that's the past. If you don't like it, then why are you here?" demanded Harriet, much too belligerently for this pleasant morning scene. Then she blushed and exclaimed, "No, I didn't mean that." "No, of course you don't mean it," said Dorothy. "You're overtired." "We're here because it's lovely," said a schoolgirl cousin of David's. She had an unhappy, or at least complicated, family background, and she had taken to spending her holidays here, her parents pleased she was having a taste of real family life. Her name was Bridget. David and Harriet were exchanging long, supportive, humorous looks, as they often did, and had not heard the schoolgirl, who was now sending them pathetic glances. "Come on, you two," said William. "Tell Bridget she's welcome." "What? What's the matter?" demanded Harriet. William said, "Bridget has to be told by you that she is welcome." "Well, we all do, from time to time," he added, in his facetious way, and could not help sending a look at his wife. "Well, naturally you are welcome, Bridget," said David. He sent a glance to Harriet, who said at once, "But of course." She meant, "That goes without saying," and the weight of 1,000 marital discussions was behind it, causing Bridget to look from David to Harriet and back, and then around the whole family, saying, "When I get married, this is what I am going to do. I'm going to be like Harriet and David, and have a big house and a lot of children, and you'll all be welcome." She was 15, a plain dark plump girl who they all knew would shortly blossom and become beautiful. They told her so. "It's natural," said Dorothy tranquilly. "You haven't any sort of a home really, so you value it." "Something wrong with that logic," said Molly. The schoolgirl looked around the table at a loss. "My mother means that you can only value something if you've experienced it," said David. "But I am the living proof that isn't so." "If you're saying you didn't have a proper home," said Molly, "that's just nonsense." "You had too," said James. "I had my room," said David. "My room, that was home." "Well, I suppose we must be grateful for that concession." "I was not aware you felt deprived," said Frederick. "I didn't, ever. I had my room." They decided to shrug and laugh. "And you haven't even thought about the problems of educating them all," said Molly. "Not so far as we can see." And now here was appearing that point of difference that the life in this house so successfully smoothed over. It went without saying that David had gone to private schools. "Luke will start at the local school this year," said Harriet. "And Helen will start next year." "Well, if that's good enough for you," said Molly. "My three went to ordinary schools," said Dorothy, not letting this slide, but Molly did not accept the challenge. She remarked, "Well, unless James chips in to help," thus making it clear that she and Frederick could not or would not contribute. James said nothing. He did not even allow himself to look ironical. "It's 5 years, 6 years, before we have to worry about the next stage of education for Luke and Helen," said Harriet, again sounding over-irritable. Insisted Molly, "We put David down for his schools when he was born. And Deborah, too." "Well," said Deborah, "why am I any better for my posh schools than Harriet or anyone else?" "It's a point," said James, who had paid for the posh schools. "Not much of a point," said Molly. William sighed, clowning it. "Deprived all the rest of us are." Poor William. Poor Sarah. Poor Bridget. Poor Harriet. "Tell me, Molly, if I had been to posh schools would I get a decent job now?" "That isn't the point," said Molly. "She means you'd be happier unemployed or in a filthy job well-educated than badly educated," said Sarah. "I'm sorry," said Molly. "Public education is awful. It's getting worse. Harriet and David have got 4 children to educate. With more to come, apparently. How do you know James will be able to help you?" "Anything can happen in the world." "Anything does, all the time," said William bitterly, but laughed to soften it. Harriet moved distressfully in her chair, took Paul off her breast with a skill at concealing herself they all noted and admired, and said, "I don't want to have this conversation. It's a lovely morning." "I'll help you, of course, within limits," said James. "Oh, James," said Harriet, "thank you, thank you." "Oh dear, why don't we go up to the woods? We could take a picnic lunch." The morning had slid past. It was midday. Sun struck the edges of the jolly red curtains, making them an intense orange, sending orange lozenges to glow on the table among cups, saucers, a bowl of fruit. The children had come down from the top of the house and were in the garden. The adults went to watch them from the windows. The garden continued neglected. There was never time for it. The lawn was patchily lush and toys lay about. Birds sang in the shrubs, ignoring the children. Little Jane, set down by Dorothy, staggered out to join the others. A group of children played noisily together, but she was too young and strayed in and out of the game, in the private world of a 2-year-old. They skillfully accommodated their game to her. The week before, Easter Sunday, this garden had had painted eggs hidden everywhere in it. A wonderful day, the children bringing in magical eggs from everywhere that Harriet and Dorothy and Bridget, the schoolgirl, had sat up half the night to decorate. Harriet and David were together at the window, the baby in her arms. He put his arm around her. They exchanged a quick look, half guilty because of the irrepressible smiles on their faces, which they felt were probably going to exasperate the others. "You two are incorrigible," said William. "They're hopeless," he said to the others. "Well, who's complaining?" "I'm not. Why don't we all go for that picnic?" The house party filled 5 cars, children wedged in or on the adults' laps. Summer was the same, 2 months of it, and again the family came and went and came again. The schoolgirl was there all the time, poor Bridget, clinging fast to this miracle of a family. Rather, in fact, as Harriet and David did. Both more than once, seeing the girl's face, reverential, even awed, always on the watch as if she feared to miss some revelation of goodness or grace the moment she allowed her attention to lapse, saw themselves. Even uneasily saw themselves. It was too much, excessive. Surely they should be saying to her, "Look here, Bridget, don't expect so much. Life isn't like that." But life is like that if you choose right, so why should they feel she couldn't have what they had so plentifully? Even before the crowd gathered before the Christmas of 1973, Harriet was pregnant again. To her utter dismay and David's. How could it have happened? They had been careful, particularly so because of their determination not to have any more children for a while. David tried to joke, "It's this room, I swear it's a baby maker." They had put off telling Dorothy. She was not there anyway, because Sarah had said it was unfair that Harriet got all the help. Harriet simply could not manage. One after another, 3 girls came to help. They had just left school and could not easily find work. They were not much good. Harriet believed she looked after them more than they her. They came or didn't come as the mood took them and would sit around drinking tea with their girlfriends while Harriet toiled. She was frantic, exhausted. She was peevish. She lost her temper. She burst into tears. David saw her sitting at the kitchen table, head in her hands, muttering that this new fetus was poisoning her. Paul lay whimpering in his pram, ignored. David took a fortnight's leave from his office to come home and help. They had known how much they owed Dorothy, but now knew it better, and that when she heard Harriet was pregnant again, she would be angry. Very. And she would be right. "It will all be easier when Christmas starts," wept Harriet. "You can't be serious," said David, furious. "Of course they can't come this Christmas. But it is so easy when people are here. Everyone helps me." "Just for once we'll go to one of them," said David, but this idea did not live for more than 5 minutes. None of the other households could accommodate 6 extra people. Harriet lay weeping on her bed. "But they must come, don't put them off, oh, David, please. At least it'll keep my mind off it." He sat on his side of the bed watching her, uneasy, critical, trying not to be. Actually, he would be pleased not to have the house full of people for 3 weeks, a month. It cost so much, and they were always short of money. He had taken on extra work, and here he was at home, a nursemaid. "You simply have to get someone in to help, Harriet. You must try and keep one of them." She burst out in indignation at the criticism. "That's not fair. You aren't here stuck with them. They aren't any good. I don't believe any of these girls have done an hour's work in their lives. They've been some help, even if it's only the washing up." Dorothy telephoned to say that both Sarah and Harriet were going to have to manage. She, Dorothy, needed a break. She was going home to her flat to please herself for a few weeks. Harriet was weeping, hardly able to speak. Dorothy could not get out of her what could possibly be wrong. She said, "Very well, I suppose I'll have to come then." She sat at the big table with David, Harriet, the 4 children there, too, and looked severely at Harriet. She had understood her daughter was pregnant again within half an hour of arriving. They could see from her set angry face that she had terrible things to say. "I'm your servant. I do the work of a servant in this house. Or you are very selfish, both of you. You are irresponsible." These words were in the air but were not spoken. They knew that if she allowed herself to begin, she would not stop with this. She sat at the head of the table, the position near the stove, stirring her tea, with one eye on baby Paul, who was fretful in his little chair and wanted to be cuddled. Dorothy, too, looked tired, and her gray hair was disordered. She had been going up to her room to tidy herself when she had been swallowed in embraces with Luke and Helen and Jane, who had missed her and knew that the crossness and impatience that had ruled the house would now be banished. "You know that everyone is expecting to come here for Christmas," she demanded heavily, not looking at them. "Oh yes, yes, yes," clamored Luke and Helen, making a song and dance of it and rushing around the kitchen. "Oh yes, when are they coming? Is Tony coming? Is Robin coming? Isn't coming?" "Sit down," said David, sharp and cold, and they gave him astonished, hurt looks and sat. "It's crazy," said Dorothy. She was flushed with the hot tea and with all the things she was forcing herself not to say. "Of course everyone has to come," Harriet said, weeping, and ran out of the room. "It's very important to her," said David apologetically. "And not to you?" This was sarcastic. "The thing is, I don't think Harriet is anywhere near herself," said David, and held his eyes on Dorothy's to make her face him. But she would not. "What does that mean, my mother isn't near herself?" inquired Luke, the 6-year-old, ready to make a word game of it. Even, perhaps, a riddle. But he was perturbed. David put out his arm, and Luke went to his father, stood close, looked up into his face. "It's all right, Luke," said David. "You've got to get someone in to help," said Dorothy. "We have tried." David explained what had happened with the 3 amiable and indifferent girls. "Doesn't surprise me. Who wants to do an honest job these days?" said Dorothy. "But you have to get someone. And I can tell you I didn't expect to end my days as your end, Sarah Skivvy." Here Luke and Helen gave their grandmother incredulous looks and burst into tears. After a pause, Dorothy controlled herself and began consoling them. "All right, it's all right," she said. "And now I'm going to put Paul and Jane to bed. You two, Luke and Helen, can put yourselves to bed. I'll come up and say good night. And then your gran is off to bed. I'm tired." The subdued children went off upstairs. Harriet did not come down again that evening. Her husband and her mother knew she was being sick, which they were used to, but were not used to ill-temper, tears, fretfulness. When the children were in bed, David did some of the work he had brought home, made himself a sandwich, and was joined by Dorothy, who had come down to make herself tea. This time they did not exchange irritabilities. They were together in a companionable silence, like 2 old campaigners facing trials and difficulties. Then David went up into the great shadowy bedroom, where lights from an upstairs window in a neighboring house a good 30 yards away sent gleams and shadows onto the ceiling. He stood looking at the big bed where Harriet lay. Asleep? Baby Paul was lying asleep close to her, unwrapped. David cautiously leaned over, folded Paul into his cuddling blanket, took him to his room next door. He saw Harriet's eyes shine as she followed his movements. He got into bed and, as always, slid out his arms so that she could put her head onto it and be gathered close to him. But she said, "Feel this," and guided his hand to her stomach. She was nearly 3 months pregnant. This new baby had not yet shown signs of independent life, but now David felt a jolt under his hand, quite a hard movement. "Can you be further along than you thought?" Once more he felt the thrust, and could not believe it. Harriet was weeping again, and he felt, knowing of course this was unfair, that she was breaking the rules of some contract between them. Tears and misery had not ever been on their agenda. She felt rejected by him. They had always loved to lie here feeling a new life, greeting it. She had waited 4 times for the first little flutters, easily mistaken, but then certain, the sensation that was as if a fish mouthed out a bubble, the small responses to her movements, her touch, and even, she was convinced, her thoughts. This morning, lying in the dark before the children woke, she had felt a tapping in her belly, demanding attention. Disbelieving, she had half sat up, looking down at her still flat, if soft, stomach, and felt the imperative beat, like a small drum. She had been keeping herself on the move all day, so as not to feel these demands from the new being, unlike anything she had known before. "You had better go and get Dr. Brett to check the dates," said David. Harriet said nothing, feeling it was beside the point. She did not know why she felt this. But she did go to Dr. Brett. He said, "Well, perhaps I was out by a month, but if so, you have really been very careless, Harriet." This scolding was what she was getting from everyone, and she flashed out, "Anyone can make a mistake." He frowned as he felt the emphatic movements in her stomach and remarked, "Well, there's nothing very much wrong with that, is there?" He looked dubious, however. He was a harassed, no longer young man, who, she had heard, had a difficult marriage. She had always felt rather superior to him. Now she felt at his mercy and was looking up into that professionally reticent face as she lay there, under his hands, longing for him to say something else. "What?" An explanation. "You'll have to take it easy," he said, turning away. Behind his back, she muttered, "Take it easy yourself," and chided herself, "You bad-tempered cow." Everyone arriving for Christmas was told Harriet was pregnant. It was a mistake, but now they were pleased, really. "But speak for yourselves," said Dorothy. People had to rally around, even more than they always did. Harriet was not to cook, do housework, do anything. She must be waited upon. Each new person looked startled on hearing this news, then made jokes. Harriet and David came into rooms full of family, talking, who fell silent knowing they were there. They had been exchanging condemnations. Dorothy's role in keeping this household going was being given full credit. The pressure on David's salary, not, after all, a large one, was mentioned. Jokes were made about James's probable reception of the news. Then the teasing began. David and Harriet were commended for their fertility, and jokes were made about the influences of their bedroom. They responded to the jokes with relief. But all this jesting had an edge on it, and people were looking at the young Lovitts differently from the way they had done before. The quietly insistent patient quality that had brought them together, that had caused this house to come into being and had summoned all these unlikely people from various parts of England and the world, too. James was coming from Bermuda. Deborah from the States, and even Jessica had promised to put in a brief appearance. This quality, whatever it was, this demand on life, which had been met in the past with respect, grudging or generous, was now showing its reverse side. In Harriet lying pale and unsociable on her bed, and then coming down determined to be one of the party but failing, and going upstairs again, in Dorothy's grim patience, for she worked from dawn to dusk and often in the night, too. And in the children's querulousness and demands for attention, particularly little Paul's. Another girl came in from the village, found by Dr. Brett. She was, like the other three, pleasant, lazy, seeing nothing to be done unless her attention was directed to it, affronted by the amount of work needed by 4 children. She did, however, enjoy the people sitting around and talking, the sociable atmosphere, and in no time she was sharing meals and sitting around with them. She found it quite in order to be waited on by them. Everyone knew that she would find an excuse to leave when this delightful house party broke up, which it did, rather earlier than usual. It was not only Jessica, in her bright summer clothes that made no concession to the English winter except for a slight cardigan, who remembered people elsewhere who had been promised visits. Jessica took herself off, and Deborah with her. James followed. Frederick had to finish a book. The enraptured schoolgirl, Bridget, found Harriet lying down, her hands pressed into her stomach, tears running down her face, moaning from some pain she would not specify, and was so shocked she, too, wept and said she had always known it was too good to last, and went off back home to her mother, who had just remarried and did not really want her. The girl who had come to help went home, and David looked for a trained nanny in London. He could not afford one, but James had said he would pay for it. Until Harriet was better, he said, uncharacteristically grumpy. He was making it clear he thought that Harriet had chosen this life and now should not expect everyone to foot the bill. But they could not find a nanny. The nannies all wanted to go abroad with families who had a baby, or perhaps 2, or to be in London. This small town and the 4 children, with another coming, put them off. Instead, Alice, a cousin of Frederick's, a widow down on her luck, came to help Dorothy. Alice was quick, fussy, nervous, like a little gray terrier. She had 3 grown-up children and grandchildren, but said she did not want to be a nuisance to them, a remark that caused Dorothy to make dry remarks, which Harriet felt like accusations. Dorothy was not pleased to have a woman of her own age sharing authority, but it could not be helped. Harriet seemed unable to do anything much. She went back to Dr. Brett, for she could not sleep or rest because of the energy of the fetus, which seemed to be trying to tear its way out of her stomach. "Just look at that," she said as her stomach heaved up, convulsed, subsided. 5 months. He made the usual tests and said, "It's large for 5 months, but not abnormally so. Have you ever had a case like this before?" Harriet sounded sharp, peremptory, and the doctor gave her an annoyed look. "I've certainly seen energetic babies before," he said shortly, and when she demanded, "At 5 months?" Like this, he refused to meet her, was dishonest, as she felt it. "I'll give you a sedative," he said. For her. But she thought of it as something to quiet the baby. Now, afraid of asking Dr. Brett, she begged tranquilizers from friends and from her sisters. She did not tell David how many she was taking, and this was the first time she had hidden anything from him. The fetus was quiet for about an hour after she dosed herself, and she was given a respite from the ceaseless battering and striving. It was so bad that she would cry out in pain. At night, David heard her moan or whimper, but now he did not offer comfort, for it seemed that these days she did not find his arms around her any help. "My God," she said, or grunted or groaned, and then suddenly sat up, or scrambled out of bed and went doubled up out of the room, fast, escaping from the pain. He had stopped putting his hand on her stomach in the old companionable way, for what he felt there was beyond what he could manage with. It was not possible that such a tiny creature could be showing such fearful strength, and yet it did. And nothing he said seemed to reach Harriet, who, he felt, was possessed, had gone right away from him, in this battle with the fetus, which he could not share. He might wake to watch her pacing the room in the dark, hour after hour. When she at last lay down, regulating her breathing, she would start up again, with an exclamation, and, knowing he was awake, would go downstairs to the big family room where she could stride up and down, groaning, swearing, weeping, without being observed. As the Easter holiday approached and the two older women made remarks about getting the house ready, Harriet said, "They can't come. They can't possibly come." "They'll expect it," said Dorothy. "We can manage," said Alice. "No," said Harriet. Wails and protests from the children, and Harriet did not soften. This made Dorothy even more disapproving. Here she was, with Alice, two capable women, doing all the work and the least Harriet could do. "You're sure you don't want them to come?" asked David, who had been begged by the children to make her change her mind. "Oh, do what you like," Harriet said. But when Easter came, Harriet was proved right. It was not a success. Her strained, abstracted face as she sat there at her table, stiffly upright, braced for the next jolt or jab, stopped conversation, spoiled the fun, the good times. "What have you got in there?" asked William, jocular but uneasy, seeing Harriet's stomach convulse. "A wrestler." "God only knows," said Harriet, and she was bitter, not joking. "How am I going to get through to July?" she demanded, in a low, appalled voice. "I can't. I simply can't do it." They all, David, too, judged that she was simply exhausted because this baby was coming too soon. She must be humored. Alone in her ordeal, and she had to be, she knew that, and did not blame her family for not accepting what she was being slowly forced to accept. She became silent, morose, suspicious of them all and their thoughts about her. The only thing that helped was to keep moving. If a dose of some sedative kept the enemy, so she now thought of this savage thing inside her quiet for an hour, then she made the most of the time and slept, grabbing sleep to her, holding it, drinking it, before she leaped out of bed as it woke with a heave and a stretch that made her feel sick. She would clean the kitchen, the living room, the stairs, wash windows, scrub cupboards, her whole body energetically denying the pain. She insisted that her mother and Alice let her work, and when they said there was no need to scrub the kitchen again, she said, "For the kitchen, no. For me, yes." By breakfast time, she might have already worked for 3 or 4 hours and looked haggard. She took David to the station and the two older children to school, then parked the car somewhere and walked. She almost ran through streets she hardly saw, hour after hour, until she understood she was causing comment. Then she took to driving a short way out of the town, where she walked along the country lanes, fast, sometimes running. People in passing cars would turn, amazed, to see this hurrying driven woman, white-faced, hair flying, open-mouthed, panting, arms clenched across her front. If they stopped to offer help, she shook her head and ran on. Time passed. It did pass, though she was held in an order of time different from those around her, and not the pregnant woman's time either, which is slow, a calendar of the growth of the hidden being. Her time was endurance, containing pain. Phantoms and chimeras inhabited her brain. She would think, when the scientists make experiments, welding two kinds of animal together, of different sizes, then I suppose this is what the poor mother feels. She imagined pathetic botched creatures, horribly real to her, the products of a Great Dane or a Borzoi with a little spaniel, a lion and a dog, a great cart horse and a little donkey, a tiger and a goat. Sometimes she believed hooves were cutting her tender inside flesh, sometimes claws. In the afternoon, she collected the children from school and, later, David from the station. She walked around the kitchen as suppers were eaten, encouraged the children to watch television, and then went up to the third floor where she hastened up and down the corridor. The family could hear her swift, heavy steps up there and did not let their eyes meet. Time passed. It did pass. The 7th month was better, and this was because of the amount of drugs she took. Appalled at the distance that had grown up between her and her husband, between her and the children, her mother, Alice, she now planned her day for one thing, that she would seem to be normal between the hours of 4, when Helen and Luke ended school, until 8 or 9, when they went to bed. The drugs did not seem to be affecting her much. She was willing them to leave her alone and to reach the baby, the fetus, this creature with whom she was locked in a struggle to survive. And for those hours it was quiet, or if it showed signs of coming awake and fighting her, she took another dose. Oh, how eager everyone was to welcome her back into the family, normal, herself, they ignored, because she wanted them to, her tenseness, her tiredness. David would put his arms around her and say, "Oh, Harriet, you are all right? 2 months to go." "Yes, yes, I am. Really." And she silently addressed the being crouching in her womb. "Now you shut up or I'll take another pill." It seemed to her that it listened and understood. A scene in the kitchen. Family supper. Harriet and David commanded the head and foot of the table. Luke and Helen sat together on one side. Alice held little Paul, who could never get enough cuddling. He got so little from his mother. Jane sat near Dorothy's place, who was at the stove, ladle in her hand. Harriet looked at her mother, a large, healthy woman in her 50s, with her bush of iron-gray curls and her pink, fresh face and her large blue eyes, like lollipops, a family joke, and thought, "I'm as strong as she is. I'll survive." And she smiled at Alice, thin, wiry, tough, energetic, and thought again, these elderly women, look at them, they've survived everything. Dorothy was filling their plates with vegetable soup. She sat down at leisure with her own plate. Bread was passed around, a big basket of it. Happiness had returned and sat at the table with them, and Harriet's hand, unseen below the level of the tabletop, was held over the enemy. "You be quiet." "A story," said Luke. "A story, Daddy." On days when there was school tomorrow, the children had supper early and went up to bed. But on Fridays and Saturdays they ate with the grown-ups and a story was told during the meal. Here, enclosed in the hospitable kitchen, it was warm and steamy with the smell of soup. Outside was a blustering night. May. The curtains were not drawn. A branch stretched across the window, a spring branch, full of pristine blossom, pale in the twilight, but the air that beat on the panes had been blasted down south from some iceberg or snow field. Harriet was spooning in soup and broke hunks of bread into it. Her appetite was enormous, insatiable, so bad she was ashamed and raided the fridge when no one could see her. She would interrupt her nocturnal peregrinations to stuff into herself anything she could find to eat. She even had secret caches like an alcoholic's hoards, only it was food, chocolate, bread, pies. David began. 2 children, a boy and a girl, set off one day to have an adventure in the forest. They went a long way into the forest. It was hot outside, but under the trees it was cool. They saw a deer lying down, resting. Birds flitted about and sang to them. David stopped to eat soup. Helen and Luke sat with their eyes on his face, motionless. Jane listened too, but differently. For years old, she looked to see how they took in the story and copied them, fixing her eyes on her father. "Do the birds sing to us?" inquired Luke doubtfully, frowning. He had a strong, severe face, and, as always, he demanded the truth. "When we're in the garden and the birds sing, are they singing to us?" "Of course not, silly," said Helen. "It was a magic forest." "Of course they sing to you," said Dorothy firmly. The children, first hunger appeased, sat with their spoons in their hands, wide eyes on their father. Harriet's heart oppressed her. It was their open trustfulness, their helplessness. The television was on. A professionally cool voice was telling about some murders in a London suburb. She lumbered over to turn it off, plodded back, served herself more soup, piled in the bread. She listened to David's voice. Tonight the storyteller's voice, so often heard in the kitchen, hers, Dorothy's. When the children got hungry, they found a bush covered with chocolate sweets. Then they found a pool made of orange juice. They were sleepy. They lay under a bush near the friendly deer. When they woke up, they said thank you to the deer and went on. Suddenly the little girl found she was alone. She and her brother had lost each other. She wanted to go home. She did not know which way to walk. She was looking for another friendly deer, or a sparrow, or any bird, to tell her where she was and show her the way out of the forest. She wandered about for a long time, and then she was thirsty again. She bent over a pool wondering if it would be orange juice, but it was water, clear, pure forest water, and it tasted of plants and stones. She drank from her hands. Here the 2 older children reached for their glasses and drank. Jane interlaced her fingers to form a cup. She sat there by the pool. Soon it would be dark. She bent over the pool to see if there was a fish who could tell her the way out of the forest, but she saw something she didn't expect. It was a girl's face, and she was looking straight up at her. It was a face she had never seen in her whole life. This strange girl was smiling, but it was a nasty smile, not friendly, and the little girl thought this other girl was going to reach up out of the water and pull her down into it. A heavy, shocked, indrawn breath from Dorothy, who felt this was too frightening at bedtime. But the children sat frozen with attention. Little Paul, grizzling on Alice's lap, earned from Helen, "Be quiet, shut up." Phyllis, that was the little girl's name, had never seen such frightening eyes. "Is that Phyllis in my nursery school?" asked Jane. "No," said Luke. "No," said Helen. David had stopped, apparently for inspiration. He was frowning, had an abstracted look, as if he had a headache. As for Harriet, she was wanting to cry out, "Stop, stop it. You are talking about me. This is what you are feeling about me." She could not believe that David did not see it. "What happened then?" asked Luke. "What happened exactly?" "Wait," said David. "Wait, my soup." He ate. "I know what happened," said Dorothy firmly. Phyllis decided to leave that nasty pool at once. She ran fast along a path until she bumped into her brother. He was looking for her. They held each other's hands, and they ran out of the forest, and they ran safely home. "That was it, exactly," said David. He was smiling ruefully, but looked bemused. "And that was what really happened, Daddy?" demanded Luke, anxious. "Absolutely," said David. "Who was that girl in the pool? Who was she?" demanded Helen, looking from her father to her mother. "Oh, just a magic girl," said David casually. "I have no idea. She just materialized." "What's materialized?" asked Luke, saying the word with difficulty. "It's bedtime," said Dorothy. "But what is materialized?" Luke insisted. "We haven't had any pudding," cried Jane. "There's no pudding, there's fruit," said Dorothy. "What is materialized, Daddy?" Luke anxiously persisted. "It is when something that wasn't there suddenly is there." "But why? Why is it?" wailed Helen, distressed. Dorothy said, "Upstairs, children." Helen took an apple, Luke another, and Jane lifted some bread off her mother's plate with a quick, conscious, mischievous smile. She had not been upset by the story. The three children went noisily up the stairs, and baby Paul looked after them, excluded, his face puckering, ready to cry. Alice swiftly got up with him and went after the children, saying, "No one told me stories when I was little." It was hard to tell whether this was a complaint or, and I'm better for it. Suddenly, Luke appeared on the landing. "Is everyone coming for the summer holidays?" David glanced worriedly at Harriet, then away. Dorothy looked steadily at her daughter. "Yes," said Harriet weakly. "Of course." Luke called up the stairs, she said, "Of course." Dorothy said, "You will have just had this baby." "It's up to you and Alice," said Harriet. "If you feel you can't cope, then you must say so." "It seems to me that I cope," said Dorothy, dry. "Yes, I know," said David quickly. "You're marvelous." "And you don't know what you would have done, don't," said David. And to Harriet, "Much better that we put things off and have them all at Christmas." "The children will be so disappointed," said Harriet. This did not sound like her old insistence. It was flat and indifferent. Her husband and her mother examined her curiously, so Harriet felt their inspection of her, detached, unkind. She said grimly, "Well, perhaps this baby will be born early. Surely it must." She laughed painfully, and then suddenly she got up, exclaiming, "I must move, I have to," and began her dogged, painful hour after hour walk back and forth, up and down. She went to Dr. Brett at 8 months and asked him to induce the baby. He looked critically at her and said, "I thought you didn't believe in it." "I don't. But this is different. Not that I can see. It's because you don't want to. It's not you who is carrying this," she cut off Monster, afraid of antagonizing him. "Look," she said, trying to sound calm, but her voice was angry and accusing. "Would you say I was an unreasonable woman? Hysterical? Difficult? Just a pathetic hysterical woman. I would say that you are utterly worn out. Bone-tired. You never did find being pregnant easy, did you? Have you forgotten? I've had you sitting here through 4 pregnancies, with all kinds of problems, all credit to you. You put up with everything very well. But it's not the same thing, it is absolutely different. I don't understand why you can't see it. Can't you see it?" She thrust out her stomach, which was heaving and, as she felt it, seething as she sat there. The doctor looked dubiously at her stomach, sighed, and wrote her a prescription for more sedatives. No, he couldn't see it. Rather, he wouldn't. That was the point. Not only he, but all of them, they wouldn't see how different this was. And as she walked, strode, ran along the country lanes, she fantasized that she took the big kitchen knife, cut open her own stomach, lifted out the child, and when they actually set eyes on each other, after this long blind struggle, what would she see? Soon, nearly a month early, the pains began. Once she started, labor had always gone quickly. Dorothy rang David in London and at once took Harriet into hospital. For the first time, Harriet had insisted on a hospital, surprising everyone. By the time she was there were strong wrenching pains, worse, she knew, than ever in the past. The baby seemed to be fighting its way out. She was bruised, she knew it. Inside she must be one enormous black bruise, and no one would ever know. When at last the moment came when she could be given oblivion, she cried out, thank God, it's over at last." She heard a nurse saying, "This one's a real little toughie, look at him." Then a woman's voice was saying, Mrs. Lovett, are you with us? Come back to us. Your husband is here, dear. You've a healthy boy." "A real little wrestler," said Dr. Brett. "He came out fighting the whole world." She raised herself with difficulty because the lower half of her body was too sore to move. The baby was put into her arms. 11 pounds of him. The others had not been more than 7 pounds. He was muscular, yellowish, long. It seemed as if he were trying to stand up, pushing his feet into her side. "He's a funny little chap," said David, and he sounded dismayed. He was not a pretty baby. He did not look like a baby at all. He had a heavy-shouldered, hunched look, as if he were crouching there as he lay. His forehead sloped from his eyebrows to his crown. His hair grew in an unusual pattern from the double crown where started a wedge or triangle that came low on the forehead, the hair lying forward in a thick yellowish stubble, while the side and back hair grew downwards. His hands were thick and heavy, with pads of muscle in the palms. He opened his eyes and looked straight up into his mother's face. They were focused greeny yellow eyes, like lumps of soapstone. She had been waiting to exchange looks with the creature who, she had been sure, had been trying to hurt her, but there was no recognition there. And her heart contracted with pity for him. Poor little beast, his mother disliking him so much. But she heard herself say nervously, though she tried to laugh, "He's like a troll, or a goblin or something." And she cuddled him, to make up. But he was stiff and heavy. "Come, Harriet," said Dr. Brett, annoyed with her. And she thought, "I've been through this with Dr. Bloody Brett 4 times, and it's always been marvelous, and now he's like a schoolmaster." She bared her breast and offered the child her nipple. The nurses, the doctor, her mother, and her husband stood watching, with the smiles that this moment imposed. But there was none of the atmosphere of festival of achievement, no champagne. On the contrary, there was a strain in everyone's apprehension. A strong, sucking reflex, and then hard gums clamped down on her nipple, and she winced. The child looked at her and bit hard. "Well," said Harriet, trying to laugh, removing him. "Try him a little more," said the nurse. He was not crying. Harriet held him out, challenging the nurse with her eyes to take him. The nurse, mouth tight with disapproval, took the baby, and he was put unprotesting in his cot. He had not cried since he was born, except for a first roar of protest or perhaps surprise. The 4 children were brought in to see their new brother in the hospital ward. The 2 other women who shared the room with her had got out of bed and taken their babies to a day room. Harriet had refused to get out of bed. She told the doctors and nurses she needed time for her internal bruises to heal. She said this almost defiantly, carelessly, indifferent to their critical looks. David stood at the end of the bed, holding baby Paul. Harriet yearned for this baby, this little child, from whom she had been separated so soon. She loved the look of him, the comical soft little face, with soft blue eyes like bluebells, she thought, and his soft little limbs. It was as if she were sliding her hands along them, and then enclosing his feet in her palms. A real baby, a real little child. The 3 older children stared down at the newcomer who was so different from them all, of a different substance, so it seemed to Harriet. Partly this was because she was still responding to the look of him with her memories of his difference in the womb, but partly it was because of his heavy, sallow lumpishness. And then there was this strange head of his, sloping back from the eyebrow ridges. "We are going to call him Ben," said Harriet. "Are we?" said David. "Yes, it suits him." Luke on one side, Helen on the other, took Ben's small hands and said, "Hello, Ben." "Hello, Ben." But the baby did not look at them. Jane, the 4-year-old, took one of his feet in her hand, then in her 2 hands, but he vigorously kicked her away. Harriet found herself thinking, I wonder what the mother would look like, the one who would welcome this alien. She stayed in bed a week, that is, until she felt she could manage the struggle ahead, and then went home with her new child. That night, in the connubial bedroom, she sat up against a stack of pillows, nursing the baby. David was watching. Ben sucked so strongly that he emptied the first breast in less than a minute. Always, when a breast was nearly empty, he ground his gums together, and so she had to snatch him away before he could begin. It looked as if she were unkindly depriving him of the breast, and she heard David's breathing change. Ben roared with rage, fastened like a leech to the other nipple, and sucked so hard she felt that her whole breast was disappearing down his throat. This time, she left him on the nipple until he ground his gums hard together, and she cried out, pulling him away. "He's extraordinary," said David, giving her the support she needed. "Yes, he is. He's absolutely not ordinary. But he's all right, he's just a normal, healthy, fine baby," said Harriet, bitter, quoting the hospital. David was silent. It was this anger, this bitterness in her that he could not handle. She was holding Ben up in the air. He was wrestling, fighting, struggling, crying in his characteristic way, which was a roar or a bellow, while he went yellowish-white with anger, not red, like a normal cross baby. When she held him to get up the wind, He seemed to be standing in her arms, and she felt weak with fear at the thought that this strength had so recently been inside her, and she at its mercy. For months, he had been fighting to get out, just as now he fought in her grasp to become independent. When she laid him in his cot, which she was always glad to do because her arms ached so badly, he bellowed out his rage, but soon lay quiet, not sleeping, fully alert, his eyes focused, and his whole body flexing and unflexing with a strong pushing movement of heels and head she was familiar with. It was what had made her feel she was being torn apart when he was inside her. She went back into bed beside David. He put out his arm so that she could lie by him, inside it, but she felt treacherous and untruthful, for he would not have liked what she was thinking. Soon she was exhausted with feeding Ben. Not that he did not thrive, he did. He was 2 pounds over his birth weight when he was a month, which was when he would have been less than a week old if he had gone full term. Her breasts were painful. Making more milk than they ever had had to do, her chest swelled into 2 bursting white globes long before the next feed was due. But Ben was already roaring for it, and she fed him, and he drained every drop in 2 or 3 minutes. She felt the milk being dragged in streams from her. Now he had begun something new. He had taken to interrupting the fierce sucking several times during a feed and bringing his gums together in the hard grinding movement that made her cry out in pain. His small cold eyes seemed to her malevolent. "I'm going to put him on the bottle," she said to Dorothy, who was watching this battle with a look. It seemed to Harriet everyone had when watching Ben. She was absolutely still and intent, fascinated, almost hypnotized, but there was repugnance there, too. And fear? Harriet had expected her mother to protest with, "But he's only 5 weeks old." But what Dorothy said was, "Yes, you must, or you'll be ill." A little later, watching Ben roar and twist and fight, she remarked, "They'll all be coming soon for the summer." She spoke in a way new to her, as if listening to what she said and afraid of what she might say. Harriet recognized it, for this was how she felt saying anything at all. So do people speak whose thoughts are running along secretly in channels they would rather other people did not know about? On that same day, Dorothy came into the bedroom where Harriet fed Ben and saw Harriet pulling the child clear of breasts that had bruises all around the nipples. She said, "Do it. Do it now. I've bought the bottles and the milk. I'm sterilizing the bottles now." "Yes, wean him," said David, agreeing at once. But she had fed the other 4 for months, and there had been hardly a bottle in the house. The adults, Harriet and David, Dorothy and Alice, were around the big table, the children having gone up to bed, and Harriet tried Ben with the bottle. He emptied it in a moment, while his body clenched and unclenched, his knees up in his stomach, then extended like a spring. He roared at the empty bottle. "Give him another," said Dorothy, and set about preparing one. "What an appetite," said Alice socially, trying hard, but she looked frightened. Ben emptied the second bottle. He was supporting it with his 2 fists, by himself. Harriet barely needed to touch it. "Neanderthal baby," said Harriet. "Oh, come on, poor little chap," said David, uneasy. "Oh God, David," said Harriet. "Poor Harriet is more like it." All right, the genes have come up with something special this time." "But what? That's the point," said Harriet. "What is he?" The other 3 said nothing, or, rather, said by their silence that they would rather not face the implications of it. "All right," said Harriet. "Let's say he has a healthy appetite, if that makes everyone happy." Dorothy took the fighting creature from Harriet, who collapsed exhausted back in her chair. Dorothy's face changed as she felt the clumsy weight of the child, the intransigence, and she shifted her position so that Ben's pistoning legs could not reach her. Soon Ben was taking in twice the amount of food recommended for his age or stage, 10 or more bottles a day. He got a milk infection, and Harriet took him to Dr. Brett. "A breastfed baby shouldn't get infections," he said. "He's not breastfed." "That's not like you, Harriet." "How old is he?" 2 months, said Harriet. She opened her dress and showed her breasts, still making milk, as if they responded to Ben's never-appeased appetite. They were bruised black all around the nipples. Dr. Brett looked at the poor breasts in silence, and Harriet looked at him, his decent, concerned doctor's face confronting a problem beyond him. "Naughty baby," he conceded, and Harriet laughed out loud in astonishment. Dr. Brett reddened, met her eyes briefly in acknowledgement of her reproach, and then looked away. "All I need is a prescription for diarrhea," said Harriet. She added deliberately, staring at him, willing him to look at her. "After all, I don't want to kill the nasty little brute." He sighed, took off his glasses, and rubbed them slowly. He was frowning, but not in disapproval of her. He said, "It is not abnormal to take a dislike to a child. I see it all the time, unfortunately." Harriet said nothing, but she was smiling unpleasantly and knew it. "Let me have a look at him." Harriet took Ben out of the pram and laid him on the table. At once he turned onto his stomach and tried to get himself on all fours. He actually succeeded for a moment before collapsing. She looked steadily at Dr. Brett, but he turned away to his desk to write a prescription. "There's obviously nothing much wrong with him," he said, with the same baffled, offended note that Ben did bring out of people. "Have you ever seen a 2-month baby do that?" she insisted. "No, I must admit I haven't." "Well, let me know how you get on." The news had flown around the family that the new baby was successfully born and everything was all right, meaning that Harriet was. A lot of people wrote and rang, saying they were looking forward to the summer holidays. They said, "We are longing to see the new baby." They said, "Is little Paul still as delicious as he was?" They arrived bringing wine and summer produce from all over the country, and all kinds of people stood bottling fruit and making jams and chutneys with Alice and Dorothy. A crowd of children played in the garden or were taken off to the woods for picnics. Little Paul, so cuddlesome and funny, was always on somebody's lap, and his laugh was heard everywhere. This was his real nature, overshadowed by Ben and his demands. Because the house was so full, the older children were in one room. Ben was already in a cot with high wooden slatted sides, where he spent his time pulling himself up to a sitting position, falling, rolling over, pulling himself up. This cot was put in the room where the older children were, in the hope that Ben would be made social, friendly, by his siblings. It was not a success. He ignored them, would not respond to their advances, and his crying, or rather, bellowing, made Luke shout at him, "Oh, shut up." But then he burst into tears at his own unkindness. Helen, at the age to cherish a baby, tried to hold Ben, but he was too strong. Then all the older children in the house were put into the attic, where they could make as much noise as they wanted, and Ben went back into his own room, the baby's room. And from there they heard his grunts and snuffles and roars of frustration as he tried some feat of strength and fell down. The new baby had, of course, been offered to everyone to hold when they asked, but it was painful to see how their faces changed confronting this phenomenon. Ben was always quickly handed back. Harriet came into the kitchen one day and heard her sister Sarah say to a cousin that Ben gives me the creeps. "He's like a goblin or a dwarf or something. I'd rather have poor Amy any day." This afflicted Harriet with remorse. Poor Ben, whom no one could love. She certainly could not. And David, the good father, hardly touched him. She lifted Ben from his cot, so much like a cage, and put him on the big bed and sat with him. Poor Ben, she crooned, stroking him. He clutched her shirt with both hands, pulled himself up, and stood on her thigh. The hard little feet hurt her. She tried to cuddle him, persuade him to soften against her. Soon she gave up, put him back in his pen, or cage, a roar of frustration because he had been put down, and she held out her hands to him. Poor Ben, dear Ben, and he grasped her hands and pulled himself up and stood grunting and roaring with triumph. 4 months old. He was like an angry, hostile little troll. She did make a point of going to him every day when the other children were out of the way, and taking him to the big bed for a time of petting and play, as she had with all of them. Never, not once, did he subside into a loving moment. He resisted, he strove, he fought, and then he turned his head and closed his jaws over her thumb. Not as an ordinary baby will, in the sucking bite that relieves the pain of teething, or explores the possibilities of a mouth, tongue. She felt her bone bend, and saw his cold, triumphant grin. She heard herself say, "You aren't going to do me in, I won't let you." But for a while she did try hard to make him ordinary. She took him down into the big living room where all the family were and put him into the playpen there until his presence affected people and they tended to go away. Or she took him to the table in her arms, as she had done with the others, but could not hold him. He was too strong. In spite of Ben, the summer holidays were wonderful. Again, there were 2 months of it. Again, David's father, briefly descending, gave them a check and they could not have managed without. "It is like being in the middle of some bloody grapefruit pudding, this house," said James. "God knows how you do it." But afterwards, when Harriet thought of those holidays, what she remembered was how they all looked at Ben. There would be a long, thoughtful stare, puzzled, even anxious, but then came fear, though everyone tried to conceal it. There was horror, too, which is what Harriet felt more and more. Soon she was shutting Ben up in his room away from everyone. He did not seem to mind or even to notice. It was hard to make out what he did think of other people. Harriet lay inside David's arms one night before sleeping, talking over the day, as they always did, and she remarked, out of a current of thoughts about the summer, "Do you know what this house is good for? What people come for? It's for a good time, that's all." He was surprised. Even she felt shocked. "But what else do we do it for?" he inquired. "I don't know," she said, sounding helpless. Then she turned into his embrace, and he held her while she wept. They had not yet resumed lovemaking. This had never happened before. Making love during pregnancy, and very soon after pregnancy, this had never been a problem. But now they were both thinking, that creature arrived when we were being as careful as we knew how. Suppose another like him comes? For they both felt, secretly, they were ashamed of the thoughts they had about Ben, that he had willed himself to be born, had invaded their ordinariness, which had no defenses against him or anything like him. But not making love was not only a strain for them both, it was a barrier, because they had to be reminded continually of what threatened them, so they felt. Then something bad happened. Just after all the family had gone away, as the school term began, Paul went into Ben's room by himself. Of all the children, he was the most fascinated by Ben. Dorothy and Alice, who were together in the kitchen, Harriet having gone off to take the older ones to school, heard screams. They ran upstairs to find that Paul had put his hand into Ben through the cot bars, and Ben had grabbed the hand and pulled Paul hard against the bars, bending the arm deliberately backwards. The two women freed Paul. They did not bother to scold Ben, who was crowing with pleasure and achievement. Paul's arm was badly sprained. No one felt like saying to the children, "Be careful of Ben." But there was no need after the incident with Paul's arm. That evening the children heard what had happened, but did not look at their parents and Dorothy and Alice. They did not look at each other. They stood silent, heads bent. This told the adults that the children's attitudes to Ben were already formed. They had discussed Ben and knew what to think about him. Luke, Helen, and Jane went away upstairs silently, and it was a bad moment for the parents. Alice said, watching them, "Poor little things." Dorothy said, "It's a shame." Harriet felt that these two women, these two elderly, tough, seasoned survivors, were condemning her, Harriet, out of their vast experience of life. She glanced at David and saw he felt the same. Condemnation and criticism and dislike. Ben seemed to cause these emotions, bring them forth out of people into the light. The day after this incident, Alice announced that she felt she was no longer needed in this house. She would go back to her own life. She was sure Dorothy could manage. After all, Jane was going to school now. Jane would not have gone to school this year, a proper school, all day, for another year. They had sent her early. Precisely because of Ben, though no one had said it. Alice left, with no suggestion it was because of Ben. But she had told Dorothy, who had told the parents, that Ben gave her the horrors. He must be a changeling. Dorothy, always sensible, calm, matter-of-fact, had laughed at her. "Yes, I laughed at her," she reported. Then, grim, "But why did I?" David and Harriet conferred, in the low, almost guilty, incredulous voices that Ben seemed to impose. This baby was not 6 months old yet. He was going to destroy their family life. He was already destroying it. They would have to make sure that he was in his room at mealtimes and when the children were downstairs with the adults. Family times, in short. Now Ben was almost always in his room, like a prisoner. He outgrew his barred cot at 9 months. Harriet caught him just as he was about to fall over the top. A small bed, an ordinary one, was put into his room. He walked easily, holding onto the walls or a chair. He had never crawled, had pulled himself straight up onto his feet. There were toys all over the floor, or rather, the fragments of them. He did not play with them. He banged them on the floor or the walls until they broke. The day he stood alone, by himself, without holding on, he roared out his triumph. All the other children had laughed, chuckled, and wanted to be loved, admired, praised, on reaching this moment of achievement. This one did not. It was a cold triumph, and he staggered about, eyes gleaming with hard pleasure, while he ignored his mother. Harriet often wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Nothing in his touch or his look ever seemed to say, "This is my mother." One early morning, something took Harriet quickly out of her bed into the baby's room, and there she saw Ben balanced on the windowsill. It was high. Heaven only knew how he had got up there. The window was open. In a moment he would have fallen out of it. Harriet was thinking, what a pity I came in, and refused to be shocked at herself. Heavy bars were put in, and there Ben would stand on the sill, gripping the bars and shaking them, and surveying the outside world, letting out his thick, raucous cries. All the Christmas holidays he was kept in that room. It was extraordinary how people, asking cautiously, "How is Ben?" and hearing, "Oh, he's all right," did not ask again. Sometimes a yell from Ben loud enough to reach downstairs silenced a conversation. Then the frown appeared on their faces that Harriet dreaded, waiting for it. She knew it masked some comment or thought that could not be voiced. And so the house was not the same. There was a constraint and a wariness in everybody. Harriet knew that sometimes people went up to look at Ben, out of the fearful, uneasy curiosity he evoked, when she was out of the way. She knew when they had seen him, because of the way they looked at her afterwards. As if I were a criminal, she raged to herself. She spent far too much of her time quietly seething, but did not seem able to stop. Even David, she believed, condemned her. She said to him, "I suppose in the old times, in primitive societies, this was how they treated a woman who'd given birth to a freak." As if it was her fault. "But we are supposed to be civilized," he said, in the patient, watchful way he now had with her. "You exaggerate everything." That's a good word for this situation. Congratulations. Exaggerate. "Oh God, Harriet," he said differently, helplessly, "don't let's do this. If we don't stand together, then." It was at Easter that the schoolgirl Bridget, who had returned to see if this miraculous kingdom of everyday life was perhaps still there, inquired, "What is wrong with him? Is he a Mongol?" "Down syndrome," said Harriet. "No one calls it Mongol now." "But no, he's not." "What's wrong with him then?" "Nothing at all," said Harriet airily. "As you can see for yourself." Bridget went away and never came back. The summer holidays again. It was 1975. There were fewer guests. Some had written or rung to say they could not afford the train fare or the petrol. "Any excuse is better than none," remarked Dorothy. "But people are hard up," said David. "They weren't so hard up before that they couldn't afford to come and live here for weeks at a time at your expense." Ben was over a year old now. He had not said one word yet, but in other ways he was more normal. Now it was difficult to keep him in his room. Children playing in the garden heard his thick, angry cries and saw him up on the sill trying to push aside his bars. So he came out of his little prison and joined them downstairs. He seemed to know that he ought to be like them. He would stand, head lowered, watching how everyone talked and laughed, sitting around the big table, or sat talking in the living room, while the children ran in and out. His eyes were on one face, then another. Whomever he was looking at became conscious of that insistent gaze and stopped talking, or turned a back or a shoulder so as not to have to see him. He could silence a room full of people just by being there, or disperse them. They went off making excuses. Towards the end of the holidays, someone came bringing a dog, a little terrier. Ben could not leave it alone. Wherever the dog was, Ben followed. He did not pet it or stroke it. He stood staring. One morning when Harriet came down to start breakfast for the children, the dog was lying dead on the kitchen floor. It had had a heart attack? Suddenly sick with suspicion, she rushed up to see if Ben was in his room. He was squatting on his bed, and when she came in, he looked up and laughed, but soundlessly, in his way, which was like a baring of the teeth. He had opened his door, gone quietly past his sleeping parents, down the stairs, found the dog, killed it, and gone back up again, quietly, into his room, and shut the door. All that, by himself. She locked Ben in. If he could kill a dog, then why not a child? When she went down again, the children were crowding around the dead dog. And then the adults came, and it was obvious what they thought. Of course it was impossible, a small child killing a lively dog. But officially the dog's death remained a mystery. The vet said it had been strangled. This business of the dog spoiled what was left of the holidays, and people went off home early. Dorothy said, "People are going to think twice about coming again." 3 months later, Mr. McGregor, the old gray cat, was killed in the same way. He had always been afraid of Ben and kept out of reach. But Ben must have stalked him or found him sleeping. At Christmas, the house was half empty. It was the worst year of Harriet's life, and she was not able to care that people avoided them. Every day was a long nightmare. She woke in the morning unable to believe she would ever get through to the evening. Ben was always on his feet and had to be watched every second. He slept very little. He spent most of the night standing on his windowsill, staring into the garden, and if Harriet looked in on him, he would turn and give her a long stare, alien, chilling. In the half-dark of the room, he really did look like a little troll or a hobgoblin crouching there. If he was locked in during the day, he screamed and bellowed so that the whole house resounded with it, and they were all afraid the police would arrive. He would suddenly, for no reason she could see, take off and run into the garden, and then out the gate and into the street. One day, she ran a mile or more after him, seeing only that stubby, squat little figure going through traffic lights, ignoring cars that hooted and people who screamed warnings at him. She was weeping, panting, half-crazed, desperate to get to him before something terrible happened, but she was praying, "Oh, do run him over. Do, yes, please." She caught up with him just before a main road, grabbed him, and held the fighting child with all her strength. He was spitting and hissing while he jerked like a monster fish in her arms. A taxi went by. She called to it. She pushed the child in and got in after him, holding him fast by an arm that seemed would break with his flailing about and fighting. What could be done? Again, she went to Dr. Brett, who examined him and said he was physically in order. Harriet described his behavior, and the doctor listened. From time to time, a well-controlled incredulity appeared on his face, and he kept his eyes down, fiddling with pencils. "You can ask David, ask my mother," said Harriet. "He's a hyperactive child. That's how they are described these days, I believe," said old-fashioned Dr. Brett. She went to him because he was old-fashioned. At last he did look at her, not evading her. "What do you expect me to do, Harriet? Drug him, silly? Well, I am against it." She was crying inwardly, "Yes, yes, yes, that's exactly what I want." But she said, "No, of course not. He's physically normal for 18 months. He's very strong and active, of course, but he's always been that. You say he's not talking? But that's not unusual. Wasn't Helen a late talker?" "I believe she was." "Yes," said Harriet. She took Ben home. Now he was locked into his room each night, and there were heavy bars on the door as well. Every second of his waking hours, he was watched. Harriet watched him while her mother managed everything else. David said, "What is the point of thanking you, Dorothy? It seems everything has gone a long way beyond thank yous. Everything has gone a long way beyond. Period," said Dorothy. Harriet was thin, red-eyed, haggard. Once again, she was bursting into tears over nothing at all. The children kept out of her way. Tact? Were they afraid of her? Dorothy suggested staying alone with Ben for a week in August, while the family went off together somewhere. Neither Harriet nor David would normally have wanted to go anywhere, for they loved their home. And what about the family coming for the summer? "I haven't noticed any rush to book themselves in," said Dorothy. They went to France with the car. For Harriet, it was all happiness. She felt she had been given back her children. She could not get enough of them, nor they of her. And Paul, her baby whom Ben had deprived her of, the wonderful 3-year-old, enchanting, a charmer, was her baby again. They were a family still. Happiness. They could hardly believe, any of them, that Ben could have taken so much away from them. When they got home, Dorothy was very tired and she had a bad bruise on her forearm and another on her cheek. She did not say what had happened. But when the children had gone to bed on the first evening, she said to Harriet and David, "I have to talk, no, sit down and listen." They sat with her at the kitchen table. "You two are going to have to face it. Ben has got to go into an institution." "But he's normal," said Harriet, grim. "The doctor says he is. He may be normal for what he is. But he is not normal for what we are. What kind of institution would take him?" "There must be something," said Dorothy, and began to cry. Now began a time when every night Harriet and David lay awake talking about what could be done. They were making love again, but it was not the same. "This must be what women felt before there was birth control," Harriet said, terrified. They waited for every period, and when it came it meant reprieve for a month. But they weren't afraid of giving birth to a troll. While they talked, they always listened for sounds from the baby's room, words they never used now, for they hurt. What was Ben doing that they had not believed him capable of? Pulling those heavy steel bars aside? "The trouble is, you get used to hell," said Harriet. "After a day with Ben, I feel as if nothing exists but him. As if nothing has ever existed. I suddenly realize I haven't remembered the others for hours. I forgot their supper yesterday. Dorothy went to the pictures, and I came down and found Helen cooking their supper. It didn't hurt them. She's 8. Having been reminded, by the week in France, of what their family life really could be, Harriet was determined not to let it all go. She found she was again silently addressing Ben. "I'm not going to let you destroy us, you won't destroy me." She was set on another real Christmas, and wrote and telephoned to everyone. She made a point of saying that Ben was much better these days. Sarah asked if it would be all right to bring Amy. This meant that she had heard, everyone had, about the dog and the cat. "It'll be all right if we are careful never to leave Amy alone with Ben," said Harriet, and Sarah, after a long silence, said, "My God, Harriet, we've been dealt a bad hand, haven't we?" "I suppose so," said Harriet, but she was rejecting this submission to being a victim of fate. Sarah, yes, with her marital problems and her Mongol child, yes. But she, Harriet, in the same boat? She said to her own children, "Please look after Amy. Never leave her alone with Ben." "Would he hurt Amy the way he hurt Mr. McGregor?" asked Jane. "He killed Mr. McGregor," Luke said fiercely. "He killed him." "And the poor dog," said Helen. Both children were accusing Harriet. "Yes," said Harriet, "he might. That's why we have to watch her all the time." The children, the way they did these days, were looking at each other, excluding her, in some understanding of their own. They went off, without looking at her. The Christmas, with fewer people, was nevertheless festive and noisy, a success, but Harriet found herself longing for it to be over. It was the strain of it all, watching Ben, watching Amy, who was the center of everything. Her head was too big, her body too squat, but she was full of love and kisses, and everyone adored her. Helen, who had longed to make a pet of Ben, was now able to love Amy. Ben watched all this, silent, and Harriet could not read the look in those cold yellow-green eyes. But then she never could. Sometimes it seemed to her that she spent her life trying to understand what Ben was feeling, thinking. Amy, who expected everyone to love her, would go up to Ben, chuckling, laughing, her arms out. Twice his age, but apparently half his age, this afflicted infant, who was radiant with affection, suddenly became silent. Her face was woeful, and she backed away, staring at him. Just like Mr. McGregor, the poor cat. Then she began to cry whenever she saw him. Ben's eyes were never off her, this other afflicted one, adored by everyone in the house. But did he know himself afflicted? Was he, in fact? What was he? Christmas ended, and Ben was 2 and a few months old. Paul was sent to a little nursery school down the road to get him away from Ben. The naturally high-spirited and friendly child was becoming nervous and irritable. He had fits of tears or of rage, throwing himself on the floor screaming, or battering at Harriet's knees, trying to get her attention, which never seemed to leave Ben. Dorothy went off to visit Sarah and her family. Harriet was alone with Ben during the day. She tried to be with him as she had with the others. She sat on the floor with building blocks and toys you could push about. She showed him colorful pictures. She sang him little rhymes. But Ben did not seem to connect with the toys or the blocks. He sat among the litter of bright objects and might put one block on another, looking at Harriet to see if this was what he should do. He stared hard at pictures held out to him, trying to decipher their language. He would never sit on Harriet's knees, but squatted by her, and when she said, "That's a bird, Ben, look, just like that bird on that tree. And that's a flower," he stared, and then turned away. Apparently, it was not that he could not understand how this block fitted into that, or how to make a pile of them, rather that he could not grasp the point of it all, nor of the flower, nor the bird. Perhaps he was too advanced for this sort of game? Sometimes Harriet thought he was. His response to her nursery pictures was that he went out into the garden and stalked a thrush on the lawn, crouching down and moving in a low, fast run, and he nearly did catch the thrush. He tore some primroses off their stems and stood with them in his hands, intently staring at them. Then he crushed them in his strong little fists and let them drop. He turned his head and saw Harriet looking at him. He seemed to be thinking that she wanted him to do something, but what? He stared at the spring flowers, looked up at a blackbird on a branch, and came slowly indoors again. One day he talked. Suddenly. He did not say Mummy or Daddy or his own name. He said, "I want cake." Harriet did not even notice at first that he was talking. Then she did and told everyone, "Ben's talking. He's using sentences." As their way was, the other children encouraged him. "That's very good, Ben, clever Ben." But he took no notice of them. From then on he announced his needs. "I want that. Give me that. Go for a walk now." His voice was heavy and uncertain, each word separate, as if his brain were a lumber house of ideas and objects, and he had to identify each one. The children were relieved he was talking normally. "Hello, Ben," one would say. "Hello," Ben replied, carefully handing back exactly what he had been given. "How are you, Ben?" Helen asked. "How are you?" he replied. "No," said Helen. "Now you must say, 'I'm very well, thank you,' or 'I'm fine.'" Ben stared while he worked it out. Then he said clumsily, "I'm very well." He watched the children, particularly Luke and Helen, all the time. He studied how they moved, sat down, stood up, copied how they ate. He had understood that these two, the older ones, were more socially accomplished than Jane, and he ignored Paul altogether. When the children watched television, he squatted near them and looked from the screen to their faces, for he needed to know what reactions were appropriate. If they laughed, then, a moment later, he contributed a loud, hard, unnatural-sounding laugh. What was natural to him, it seemed, in the way of amusement was his hostile-looking teeth-bared grin that looked hostile. When they became silent and still with attention because of some exciting moment, then he tensed his muscles, like them, and seemed absorbed in the screen, but really he kept his eyes on them. Altogether, he was easier. Harriet thought, well, any ordinary child is at its most difficult for about a year after it gets to its feet. No sense of self-preservation, no sense of danger. They hurl themselves off beds and chairs, launch themselves into space, run into roads, have to be watched every second. And they are also, she added, at their most charming, delightful, heartbreakingly sweet and funny. And then they gradually become sensible and life is easier. Life had become easier, but this was only as she saw it, as Dorothy brought home to her. Dorothy came back to this household after what she called a rest of some weeks, and Harriet could see her mother was preparing for a real talk with her. "Now, girl, would you say that I am interfering? That I give you a lot of unwanted advice?" They were sitting at the big table, mid-morning, with cups of coffee. Ben was where they could watch him, as always. Dorothy was trying to make what she said humorous, but Harriet felt threatened. Her mother's honest pink cheeks were bright with embarrassment, her blue eyes anxious. "No," said Harriet. "You aren't. You don't. Well, now I'm going to have my say." But she had to stop. Ben began banging a stone against a metal tray. He did this with all his force. The noise was awful, but the women waited until Ben stopped, interrupted. He would have raged and hissed and spat. "You have 5 children," Dorothy said. "Not one. Do you realize that I might just as well be the mother of the others when I'm here?" "No, I don't believe you do. You've got so taken over by—" Ben again banged the tray with his stone, in a frenzy of exulting accomplishment. It looked as if he believed he was hammering metal, forging something. One could easily imagine him, in the mines deep under the earth, with his kind. Again they waited until he stopped the noise. "It's not right," said Dorothy. And Harriet remembered how her mother's "that's not right" had regulated her childhood. "I'm getting on, you know," said Dorothy. "I can't go on like this, or I'll get ill." Yes, Dorothy was rather thin, even gaunt. Yes, Harriet thought, full of guilt as usual, she should have noticed. "And you have a husband, too," said Dorothy, apparently not knowing how she was turning the knife in her daughter's heart. "He's very good, you know, Harriet. I don't know how he puts up with it."